Let's get cooking. Welcome back to the Science of Taste series. I'm your host, Chef Meg, Executive Director of the Academy of Edible Sciences and Ethno-gastronomy right here in North County, San Diego. Thanks for joining us for today's episode. We're on episode number 9, and that is looking in focus on cheese, which cheese is one of my favorite things to eat. I'm assuming for most of you out there, you would agree to that. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the chemistry behind cheese, the process generally of how cheese is made. And for this week's dish, we're gonna be making a homemade fresh ricotta cheese from a few simple ingredients of just whole milk, a little salt, and some lemon juice, where we'll then make a simple appetizer with some nori crackers and a little bit of grapefruit. So stay with us. Let's start though with looking in focus on cheese and some of that process behind it. So let's go to the whiteboard. All right, so what is cheese exactly? We could define it as a congealed lump of curdled milk that is fermented or broken down by microbes to give its distinct taste. And that's the simplest version. Depending on the type of cheese that we're making, there may be other steps, many other steps, and aging that's included. So we'll look at that in a minute here, but looking at cheese in general, the word cheese came from the Latin term caseus, or from casein. And the origins of when we can look back on when cheese was first started to be made goes back anywhere to up to 8,000 BCE. And they don't know exactly when humans started making cheese, but they believe when sheep was domesticated. So around that time of 8,000 BCE is when the cheese making process began. So very long time ago. And you'd hope by now that we would have created a lot of really delicious cheeses to eat. We've had a lot of time to perfect it. And at this point, worldwide, we have over 17,000 varieties of cheese. So to all those cheese lovers out there, there's an endless amount of discovery in terms of cheese and the flavors and the process of making it. Now let's look at that process of making cheese. It begins with the milk itself from an animal, right? And typically it's from a cow, from a buffalo perhaps, goat or sheep, but there's even circumstances where camel's milk has been used to make cheese. But those are the general common ones, especially cow. And whether they use the milk raw or it's pasteurized, which is just a process where heat is applied, a really high heat. When milk is pasteurized, though, to a high level, then we actually lose some nuances of the taste, of the flavor. So oftentimes, even raw milk is used in the cheese making process. And while that happens, when they're choosing the milk, the fat percentage content is determined because that's going to impact the process of the cheese making. So they'll determine some of those factors. What's the percentage of fat? What's the percentage of protein? So then the milk is put into large vats, and these vats may be heated up to a certain temperature, not necessarily super high, for a certain amount of time, just so that we start to have the right conditions for when we add our starter culture, which is typically what might be called rennet or bacteria that's added, perhaps even a yeast that depends on the type of cheese that we're making. And we want to keep it at that temperature and at that level so that that bacteria can begin to proliferate in the proper conditions for a set amount of time, depending on the cheese that's being made. And as we allow this culture to mix and sit within the milk, then we begin to have a separation that occurs. And we want that separation because it's going to make the curds itself and separate essentially like fat globules that will that will trap in some proteins from the milk and then separate out what is called the whey, or that liquid that's left behind. And these fat and protein globules will float to the surface because they're less dense than that liquid, than that whey that's left behind. And that's essentially curdling that's happening to the milk. But it's a controlled curdling process. And those curds that are then separated from the whey and strained or drained off, depending on the size of the curds that we want, they may be cut smaller, especially for the harder aged cheese. Those curds will be chopped up pretty finely. And then what happens is we take those curds and we press them together or put them into molds, meaning shapes pressed in together. So we push those curds in together into a mold. And depending on the type of cheese that we're making, we may add a brine to it, which is a salty liquid. We may add wine or cider to the curds into the molds. We may add mold itself, meaning fungi, which is what blue cheese is made from. Or we may add other types of bacteria or yeast to the outside of that cheese, because that's going to impact the flavor, essentially, of the cheese as time goes on. And then these molds are aged anywhere from days to weeks to even years. Other factors that may influence the type of cheese that we're making is the humidity of the rooms that the cheese is kept in, the time, as we discussed, and even the temperature. All right, let's talk just a little bit about blue cheese. I want to mention it. So the blue cheese is made from a fungi, and depending on the type of blue cheese, for example, Roquefort cheese comes from a fungi. The genus and species name is Penicillium roqueforti. So the species name itself is kind of referring to the cheese that we end up with. And how they make this cheese is, after it's pressed into molds, they'll poke it with a bunch of holes, right? And then that type of fungi, they'll spread over the cheese, over the holes in the cheese. And that distinct blue veins that forms in the blue cheese is made directly from the process of that fungi eating and digesting some of the fats in the cheese. And when we think of the word penicillium, you may think of the word penicillin, which is the same derivative of that life-saving antibiotic, penicillin, that many of us may take if we have a bacterial infection in our body. Now, some of us are allergic to penicillin. I am. However, I can eat blue cheese. And that's because during this process of the cheese fermenting, the penicillium itself is rendered neutral through that process. So I can eat blue cheese and not have an allergic reaction to it. Whereas if I take the derivative of this for a bacterial infection, then I would have a reaction and get sick. So don't be afraid to eat blue cheese, those of you that are allergic to penicillin out there. So this process where we're adding surface microbes to our cheese has a lot to do with the end product and its taste and what's called aromatic compounds that are formed. So let's talk just a little bit of organic chemistry today. Now, when we're adding these different types of bacteria or fungi to our cheese, then what's happening is they have their own enzymes that are digesting the different proteins and even fats and breaking those down within the cheese itself. So our building blocks of protein, like we discussed last week, are called amino acids. And these amino acids from these enzymes begin to break down and separate. And the next stage then is certain compounds that are formed from these amino acids separating, and they are called amines. And amines are very smelly compounds. So some of our cheeses are smellier than others, and really amines are a derivative of ammonia. So we have these smellier stages of some cheese, and some cheese will even maybe end in that stage. Others, however, will continue on in the process, where then we have these more flavorful compounds that are created through time and through this process of breaking things down within the cheese itself, and aldehydes are then formed. And our aldehydes, for example, benzoaldehyde has more of a nutty flavor to it, but some other compounds that may be formed have more woody taste or grassy taste to it, maybe even a little spicy or tart. And all of these different flavors are formed depending on the types of aldehydes or even alcohols that are produced from this process that it undergoes. I want to show you one example of this, and that is looking at Camembert cheese. So it's a French cheese, it's a soft cheese. I'm going to hold some up here for you. So this Camembert cheese, it is a soft cheese, and I want to talk about how it's going to undergo that process that it is soft, okay, in the center, especially ooey and gooey in the center, right? That takes some time. And again, for this type of French cheese, it has a fungi that's spread on top of the cheese, on the outside of it, that's called Penicillium camemberti. Okay, so again, that species name is referring to the type of cheese that we end up with. And what happens is the lactose inside of the cheese is broken down into what's called lactic acid. And that lactic acid will then break down further into carbon dioxide and water. And then eventually we end up with this calcium phosphate that's on the inside of the cheese, that from this process of the lactic acid breaking down is actually going to pull that calcium phosphate inside of the cheese towards the outside. So pulling it from the center outward. And what happens is that's increasing the pH, okay, towards the outside. And it essentially is softening our cheese from the inside out. And that's why the inside is more ooey gooey. And that's why the outside actually has a higher pH and a higher level of calcium phosphate, because of this process that it's undergoing due to the fungi that is put on the outside of the cheese. All right, so let's look at just a few of our cheeses that I have. For example, today we talked a little bit about that blue cheese, that Roquefort Blue cheese, or other types of blue cheese out there. Again, depending on the type of species of the mold that we're using and spreading on. We have soft cheeses like that Camembert from France. We have a Boursin cheese, which in the process of making this soft cheese, different flavors are added in, and it's not aged very long. It's pretty fresh cheese. And we have some feta cheese here, which is a distinctively salty cheese, and that's because it's soaked in a brine, in that salty liquid that I referred to earlier. And some feta is made from cow, some feta may be made from goat, and some feta might be made from sheep as well. So don't assume that all feta is made from sheep, because it's not. And I actually have some issues digesting lactose, and I find for myself that as I've gotten older, that if I eat cheese that is made from goats or from sheep, that I tend to digest that better. And so I make sure that I look at packaging and that I determine whether or not it really is made from which animal. So I really prefer that sheep's milk feta. It has a different kind of earthy quality to it and creaminess. It's not the same as if it's made from cow. I have some Gouda here as well. Gouda's got that distinct nutty flavor to it, and it melts really well, which there's different properties of cheese depending on that fat content, depending on how those proteins are aligned, will influence whether or not the cheese is going to melt well and whether it'll be that kind of stringy melted cheese, or whether it won't melt at all, right? Kind of like ricotta. Ricotta isn't something that melts and ooey gooey like that. So for today's appetizer dish that we're going to be making, I'll show you the simple steps of making a fresh ricotta cheese. And this is something that can be made pretty quickly. It can sit just 20 minutes after you make it if you want it more soft, or you can let it sit overnight for a little harder, firmer ricotta cheese. But this is a quick, unfermented, fresh cheese recipe that I will show you. And we are going to serve that with some simple Nori crackers that I'll make in just a minute here, and a little bit of brûlée caramelized grapefruit that adds a little citrus component into there. This is a dish that I really love. It hits the spot. Guests really seem to love it as well, and it's a quick, relatively simple dish. So let's start with our Nori crackers. And you're gonna need some Nori sheets, which are seaweed, right? Okay. I'm just gonna make one sheet of crackers because we can cut these up. But depending on how many people you're serving this dish to, I'd say one sheet is probably good for 4 people. And we're gonna place our Nori onto a baking sheet that's lined with some parchment. And for this is the base of our cracker. What we're gonna add on top of it is a little mixture of a little bit of almond flour. So I'm gonna start with a 1/4 cup of almond flour. I'm going to add a little bit of ground flax. About a tablespoon. And then I'm going to add in a little bit of soy sauce, a little bit of sesame oil, and a little bit of this coconut nectar, which you can just substitute for either maple syrup or any other sugar. So for the soy, I'm gonna add in just a few teaspoons. For our sesame oil, I'm gonna add in a teaspoon. For our coconut nectar, I'm gonna add in a couple teaspoons. Let's start to mix this up. And I'm also going to add in a little bit of chopped almonds. These are just slivered almonds, but you have any other type of almond will do. And a little bit of black sesame. Maybe a tablespoon of the black sesame. And a tablespoon or so of the almonds. Mix that up. So it looks kind of like a paste. Okay. And then we're gonna smear this on top of the base of our cracker, so onto our Nori. You can kind of hold on to the edges as you lay it a little thinner. And it doesn't have to be perfect. We're sticking it in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit so that this can crisp up and caramelize a bit. And after we pull it out, we'll let it rest and cool down, and it'll harden, and then we can cut it or break it into little crackers for our dish. All right, so there's our crackers, and I'm actually gonna finish it with a little bit of what's called furikake spice. And you can usually find this in the Asian section. It's just has a lot of different Asian ingredients in it. Sesame seeds, some more nori, but that's kind of toasted and ground up. And maybe some other flavors in there as well, depending on the blend. I'm just gonna shake a little bit on top. Okay. Sometimes I even like to use a fork just to kind of press it down. And it also gives it a nice texture for when it comes out of the oven. And I'm gonna stick this into the oven for about 8 minutes and check it, but you should be able to smell it. It's gonna start to smell really toasted, and that sugar, or if you use the coconut nectar, you'll start to smell it caramelizing in the oven. If it starts to smell like it's burning, that means you should pull it out because it's been in there too long. All right, let's pop it in the oven. All right, for our fresh homemade ricotta cheese, what we're going to need is some whole milk. Now this is cow's milk. I have tried this recipe with goat's milk as well. Just be aware though that the curd, the size of the cheese that you're going to make from the goat's milk is going to be smaller. It's not going to lump together as well as the cow's milk. So maybe start with the cow's milk first through this process, so you can get used to it before you move on to trying other milk. So whole milk, cow's milk, and we're just going to pour that into a saucepan. And then we're going to heat this milk over medium level of heat until it comes just under a boil. We can even check the temperature. You want it anywhere between 165 degrees Fahrenheit to 189-ish, but just underneath that boil is typically pretty good. And then we're gonna add 2.5 teaspoons of salt and the whole juice of 1 lemon. Now you could also use a white vinegar if you'd like, and you probably would end up adding about 2 tablespoons of vinegar. And I'll show you that process on the stovetop. It happens pretty quickly as those curds start to form. Then what we would do is strain it out. So put it through a strainer and also through some muslin, or if you have any other, like even old cloth can work, as long as it's not too thick but also not too thin, so that we can strain out those curds best. And what's going to be left behind in our bowl is that whey. And interestingly enough, this whey is oftentimes used in the production of baby's formula, or even in certain sports nutrition drinks. So a lot of people might discard this, but maybe you can look up some recipes online and how to use this whey and not discard it. And then what's left behind is our fresh ricotta cheese. And this I made this morning. So this has sat for a few hours, and we can see how soft it is. If you let it sit for just 20 minutes or so, it'll be even creamier and softer. But this is a nice level of letting it sit just a few hours. If you want it more firm, then you can even let it sit overnight. And this will store in the fridge up to 3 days just fine. So I like making that fresh ricotta cheese. You really will taste the difference of it being made fresh at home versus buying it in the store. And for the last component of our dish that we want to prep is our grapefruit. So I've got 1 grapefruit here, and we're going to essentially brûlée the grapefruit. Now, if you have a little torch, then you can do that with the torch, or you can just do it in a hot pan or a cast iron pan. And we're gonna add a little bit of turbinado sugar, or whatever kind of sugar that you have on hand is fine. I'm gonna do some that are slices. Okay, this, and I'm gonna cut it again, so into quarters essentially. I'm going to add a little bit of turbinado sugar on top, just a little sprinkle. And these are the ones that I'm going to caramelize in the pan. Okay, let's head over to the stovetop. All right, so we have our milk on to a medium level high heat. And we're gonna bring that up to temperature. I've got a temperature probe right next to me that I can check it, make sure we're not going too high. But I know that as long as we're not getting to a rolling boil, we're not gonna burn our milk, and we'll keep it at a good enough heat. So while our milk is heating, I have a cast iron pan that I've also heated right next to it. And we're just going to caramelize our grapefruit real quick as we wait for our milk to come up to temperature. And these will not take long. Just a minute or two. And don't be afraid of turning that heat up pretty high on your cast iron. We want to get a little bit of char onto our grapefruit. Okay, these look good. Turn our heat off. We've got our grapefruit. Okay, I'm going to use my probe and check what temperature that we're at for our milk. And I'm at about 165. So that is definitely hot enough. I'm going to add 2.5 teaspoons of salt. Mix that in a little bit. And we should be coming really close to just under a boil, and that's when I'm going to squeeze in my lemon. And if you want to, you can squeeze your lemon over a colander to make sure that the seeds don't go in there. So I want the juice of a whole lemon. And sometimes you'll begin to see a separation right away as soon as you add that lemon. And it's because we're adding an acid that essentially is unraveling the proteins that's inside of the milk. And that's what causes it to curdle, is as soon as those proteins begin to unfold, we're denaturing our protein. And you can give it a gentle mix, and we can already begin to see some curds forming. These are a little smaller of curds, but as our temperature sits there, we begin to see it starting to separate more, which is great. And we're getting just to under that boil. I'm gonna line my colander, a little bit of cloth, a little bit of muslin, if you have it. All right, and I'm gonna take this off the heat and I'm gonna let it sit for 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes, just to let it continue to separate before I pour it into our cloth and our muslin and strain out our curds from that whey liquid that's left behind. So we're just gonna let that rest and then we'll separate it out. All right, we have all of our components to our dish ready, so let's plate. We've got our ricotta that we made this morning, ready to go. We've got our nori cracker that came out of the oven. We let it sit and crisp up and cool off a little bit. I'm also going to use a little bit of fresh basil that we will cut chiffonnade. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take these basil leaves and I'm going to layer them up on top of each other, right inside of each other like that. Okay. And then I'm going to roll it up lengthwise, really, really tightly. Tightly as I kind of can. And then I'm going to take a nice and sharp knife and really tiny and finely slice down our rolled basil. This is called a chiffonnade. Let's cut our cracker. Here it's kind of crunchy. You can cut it into any kinds of shapes, kind of make it look nice for plating. Some longer ones, whether it's pointy or more triangular. Now let's scoop some of our fresh ricotta into our bowl. Layer it with a little bit of this cracker. So, a little bit of our fresh segmented grapefruit. And I'm also going to put in some of our brûlée grapefruit. That's going to add a different, more bitter, umami even taste to our citrus. A few in there. This presentation. I want a little bit of olive oil. I think hemp oil actually goes really nice on this dish too, because hemp oil again has a kind of earthy, almost umami quality to it that we also get from these Japanese flavors of our nori and our furikake spice that's on top, even those almonds. And then I'm gonna add just a little bit of this chiffonnade basil on top. Any nice sea salt that you have, but I have some smoked Yahweh Hawaiian sea salt that I'm just gonna sprinkle more so on top of our fresh ricotta cheese. I've got a little bit of microgreens for plating, but also look beautiful, taste good. Layer those maybe in the back here. Around the outside. Purple. A little bit of fresh cracked pepper. Add just a little more cheese on there. You can see that. Nice firm curds. And I also have just a little bit of chamomile that I ground up a little bit. Just gonna sprinkle a little on top. Okay. And there we have it. Our fresh homemade ricotta cheese that you can make in under 30 minutes if you want it nice and soft, or up to a few hours if you want to have it a little more firm there. All right, now it's taste testing time. I'm gonna start with my cracker here. Smear just a little bit of this ricotta on. Okay. A little bit of that grapefruit, a little bit of our basil. This is a really lovely dish if you want to start with at home, because there's so many different flavors in it. It's just going to open up your palate and awaken, you know, the senses and the different flavor profiles of everything in this dish. Really, really delicious. I hope you guys tried this out at home. We would love to connect with you, so please feel free to reach out to us and share with us whether or not you made the ricotta today, and if you had any questions along that process, and how you liked this dish, along with any of our other previous episodes from this Science of Taste series, brought to you from the Academy of Edible Sciences and Ethno-gastronomy. We'll see you next week for our very final episode, where we're going to actually talk further about flavor pairings and aromatic compounds and how we can use science to determine what ingredients might go best together. So we look forward to you joining us next week for our final episode for this Science of Taste series. We'll see you then.